During World War II, the United States government constructed airfields and Japanese internment camps in Arkansas. What eventually became Eaker Air Force Base started off as an Army airfield. It was built in 1942 and was one of many airfields built during the war in the country's midsection. This was done primarily to keep important military targets away from coastlines, where they would be more vulnerable to attacks from the Germans and Japanese. To members of the military, the rural area was an unlikely target that possessed a great advantage. It was located near the Mississippi River, where supplies could easily be shipped in if necessary. The airfield added a great deal of excitement to the rural communities of Gosnell and Blytheville. Both towns were relatively young compared to other Delta communities. Blytheville, the larger of the two, had been incorporated in 1891, a rather late date in the development of the state. The fertile soil located in Mississippi County produced more cotton than any other county in the country. World War II ended in 1945, but the need to keep an airfield in Mississippi County was just as important as it had been during the war, due to the rise of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. In 1946, the airfield was designated as a Strategic Air Command operation. Cold War tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States continued to escalate after the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949. The United States spared no expense in building a military infrastructure to counter the Soviet Union's support of communism throughout the world. For the military, the B-52 bomber was an absolute necessity for fighting a war of intimidation with the Soviets. These heavy aircraft were used to carry tons of ammunition, including nuclear warheads. While the airfield at Blytheville was built to launch airplanes during World War II, it soon became a prime area to build an actual air base to compete in the Cold War. In 1955, the Blytheville Air Force Base was officially christened as a single mission base. It consumed 3,771 acres of land once used to grow cotton. The surrounding communities watched as military funding and personnel poured into the base. The military personnel moving into the community consisted of scientists, skilled pilots, engineers, and other professionals. The base's official name was changed to honor Ira Eaker in 1988. The decision to close Eaker Air Force Base in the early 1990s was not difficult for the Department of Defense. The Cold War with the Soviet Union was slowly coming to an end, and the need for a massive air force declined. The military had focused on the development of new technology throughout the 1980s and had started to manufacture B-2 bombers that could fly approximately 6,000 miles without refueling. The B-2 bomber's crew consisted of only 2 men compared to the 5 to 6 man crew of the B-52. The B-52 had been replaced by a more efficient and effective aircraft that required far fewer bases than its predecessor. The military made a decision to retire the large flying fortresses, and Eaker Air Force Base was a single mission base, and that mission had been to house and launch the aircraft. Eaker Air Force Base had topped the list of bases to be closed by the Air Force. It received its ranking based on its location and the fact that it would require more fuel to fly abroad. Unfortunately for the surrounding communities, it also received a high rating for the effect it would have on the local population and the economy. Although the military had no way of determining the actual impact of the base closing, it knew that the population would be reduced drastically, and the loss of revenue would be devastating to the surrounding area. The possible blow to the community was taken into consideration, but it was given very little weight when compared to the savings the military would incur by closing the base. Given the diminishing Soviet threat in the early 1990s, the base closing was probably inevitable. For an entire generation, the base had been a constant source of revenue and security. Driving by gates monitored by armed guards seemed as normal as watching cotton pickers in the fields. For the members of the community to hear the announcement in 1991, it was a shock wave that meant uncertainty and insecurity. Overnight, childhood friends would disappear, and with them, teachers and funding. Eventually, the community would suffer and no doubt would have rising poverty levels and unemployment rates. The community would have to rely on private industries and businesses for revenue, and private industries are never as stable as good old Uncle Sam. Eaker Air Force Base officially closed in 1992. The military had 6 years to dispense with base property and start a costly environmental cleansing process that prevented the use of certain portions of the base. The base would be divided up and used for a variety of purposes. The majority of the land would initially be retained by the federal government and given to certain government agencies. Approximately one-third of the land would be handed over to the state and local authorities. Under federal guidelines, land could be given to rural communities and businesses if a potential economic benefit was shown. The withdrawal of the last 3,500 airmen in December 1992 had an immediate impact on the community's educational institutions. The Gosnell school system, once considered to be the best in the district, lost half of its students. The school district that once had a reputation for paying its teachers more money than any surrounding district was forced to lay off 60 of its faculty members. The town lost approximately $2.8 million in state aid due to lower enrollment. Mississippi County Community College, now known as Arkansas Northeastern College, lost about 20% of its students. Although both schools have recovered considerably, lack of enrollment still remains a major concern for schools in the region. The base was surrounded by houses that were once considered prime real estate by investors. Some of these homes were rented and sold for large amounts of money compared to other homes in the area when the base was active. The value of homes was an important factor used by the General Accounting Office when determining the economic impact of base closings on local communities. The official GAO follow-up report issued by the agency in 1998 actually used the home values in the area to make a case for how little of an effect the base closing had on the long-term economic security of the community. The federal and state government did provide some immediate economic relief to Mississippi County. Blytheville and Gosnell benefited from tax revenue and grant money throughout the 1990s. The two cities' tax shared revenue was based on the 1990 census, and although the population declined after the base closing, each continued to receive the inflated shared tax revenue for another 8 years. The military was particularly concerned with more rural areas like those found in Mississippi County when air base closures occurred. Unemployment rates soared in the most rural areas where the base is closed. It was much easier in urban areas to absorb the closings due to the diversity of the economy and the availability of jobs. Mississippi County had a lengthy history of high unemployment figures. The closing of the air base may have affected employment in the community, but it certainly was not the first time the county had struggled with the issue. In 1988, Mississippi County had an unemployment rate of 9.7%. Even though it would be 4 more years until the base closed, it was still considered high compared to the national average of 5.1%. The unemployment rate increased to 10% in 1991, the year before the base closed. The year after the base closing, the unemployment rate peaked at 15.8%. In 2005, the unemployment rate was 8.5%, and although this is still considered high when compared to the national average, it is lower than it was prior to the air base closing. The most difficult task in trying to ascertain the direct impact of the base closing on Blytheville and Gosnell is that other factors must be included that are not necessarily related to the base. Business and commerce in Mississippi County was once dominated by cotton production and the river. The introduction of the air base brought with it revenue and people who were interested in buying more mainstream goods. Smaller downtown businesses boomed, and nationwide chain stores moved into the area. The stability of the air base gave investors the motivation they needed to invest in Blytheville. The greater flow of revenue strengthened banks, many of which were nearly shut down during the Depression years, and they made smaller business loans readily available. Revenue was now accessible to fund stores, restaurants, movie theaters, and other public services. Population loss can have a devastating effect on any community, especially in more rural areas like Mississippi County. The economy had been dominated by agriculture prior to the introduction of the air base. Most of the counties in the Delta region had higher populations prior to the mechanization of farming in the 1950s. The mechanization of farming was fueled by new technology and innovation. As the air base was moving into Mississippi County, better tractors and farming equipment were also coming into the region. Fewer sharecroppers and laborers were needed. The county's population was actually higher in 1930, prior to the introduction of the base, than it was in the year 2000. In 1930, the population of Mississippi County was 69,289. The population had grown by nearly 40,000 in the 2 decades prior. This coincides with agricultural development in the region. The growth trend continued until 1950, when it reached its highest level at 82,375. Although the airfield had been built in 1942, the base itself was not christened until 1955. The base closing in 1992 took over 3,500 people with it, and also numerous civilian jobs. Mississippi County lost over 5,000 residents between 1990 and 2000. The ramifications of the base closing were not just about numbers. As the military base, it had employed numerous specialists, doctors, scientists, engineers, and other well-educated officials. Many of the military personnel were interested in the arts and participated in civic activities and events. The downtown Ritz Civic Center housed numerous plays and poetry readings attended by base personnel. Although through persistent community involvement in these activities they have continued, the audience for such events has decreased. The base closing created an uncertain economic environment that could frighten away potential as well as existing investors. Some of the larger chain stores were forced out of business, but the closing of the air base may not be completely to blame for businesses leaving the community. In early 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement went into effect. Potential and existing investors had anticipated the agreement for well over a year. It ended trade barriers between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and subsequently resulted in some American factories packing up and heading to the 2 other countries for cheaper labor and costs. With the air base closing and NAFTA going into effect, Mississippi County appeared far less attractive to domestic investors. It would be a foreign investor trying to locate to the United States in order to lower production costs that would be a major player in sustaining the economy of Mississippi County. Nucor Yamato Steel built a steel mill along the Mississippi River in 1987. Located in the small community of Armorel, the steel mill was just a few miles away from Blytheville. The Japanese company was not only attracted to the area because of its river access, but also because of Arkansas's right-to-work laws. Nucor built another plant in a small community called Hickman. In 2014, another steel operation, Big River Steel, began operations in the southern part of Mississippi County. The steel mills have brought numerous jobs to the region. The property located on the base itself has been used to help the community and create more jobs. Of the 700 plus jobs lost due to the base closing, many have been made up by smaller companies, some of which are located on the base itself. It took several years for the military to perform the necessary environmental cleanup required by the EPA. The deeds to the base were not handed over until 1998. Now called the Arkansas Aeroplex, sections of the former Air Force Base are used by a number of businesses, federal agencies, and several nonprofit organizations. Structures, facilities, and the base's 11,600-foot runway continue to be used. The runway is the longest available for public use in the state. In 1995, a nonprofit group called Main Street Blytheville formed to attract both public and private interest in the community. It created the largest Christmas lighting display in the Mid-South region. The Lights of the Delta covers approximately 40 acres of land located on the south side of the former Air Force Base. In the first year alone, it brought in 60,000 visitors. Some acreage located on the south side of the base has a sports complex with 8 baseball fields, 4 soccer fields, and a concession and picnic area. It is located next to the Thunder Bayou Golf Course, another community addition to the former air base. The 18-hole golf course was funded by a city tax. In 2002, Thunder Bayou was ranked by Golf Digest as one of the 100 best new courses and one of the top public courses in the state. Handing over the air base for civilian use allowed archaeologists and historians to conduct research about the earliest settlers in the region. These people lived in the Delta area long before the first Europeans arrived in the early 16th century. For several years, beginning in 2004, the Arkansas Archaeological Survey created an archaeological station on the south side of the former air base. With the aid of several state universities, most notably the University of Arkansas, archaeologist Claudine Payne and her assistant Marion Haynes were able to study 10,000 years of Mississippi County history. The majority of their studies center on people living in the area between 14 and 1600 CE. The Mississippian native culture was scattered throughout the Mississippi River's alluvial floodplain. Numerous pre-Columbian artifacts were uncovered that provide some insight into these people's everyday lives. Another phenomenal discovery at the site was evidence of a fault line that dates back to approximately 550 years ago. One of the worst potential threats to this region of the country is the New Madrid Fault Line, which shook the area in 1811 and 1812. While the archaeological station is no longer on the air base, many artifacts from the dig site are on display at the Delta Gateway Museum. The closing of Eaker Air Base was a decision made as a result of new innovations and the end of the Cold War. As the military base closed, nuclear warheads were transferred to other bases for storage or dismantle. The closing of the base represented the end of one era and the beginning of another, not only for Mississippi County, but for the entire country. Since the closing of the base, the community has focused on internal economic and social development without the ever-present fear of total destruction. As seen in this presentation, the Delta Gateway Museum in the historic Crest Building on Main Street in Blytheville displays a number of artifacts and photos from when the base was active. Plans are also underway for the base to be home to the National Cold War Museum. Eaker Air Force Base is an ideal location to interpret the legacy of a standoff between rival nations that lasted for a half a century. A special thanks to the Delta Gateway Museum for hosting this presentation. The museum's mission is to tell the story of Blytheville and the surrounding area by interpreting the land and its impact on the people.